Welcome. In this video, I'd like to return to the topic of the writing process. But rather than focusing on conducting research, listing topics, creating a thesis, I'd like to address the peculiar needs that face academic writers. All persuasive writing requires the presentation of a claim and evidence in defense of that claim such that the recipient, the reader or the listener or the viewer, is most likely to be persuaded to accept the claim. And remember, the principal claim presented in any work is called the thesis. So I suppose it's not too far afield to say that the purpose of academic writing is to present a thesis that is likely to be accepted by the intended audience. And so in this video, the first element of the academic writing process is identification of the intended audience for the student's paper. And for the next few minutes, I'd like to address specifically that audience analysis, and presenting a paper for a particular identified audience. Unlike high school level writing, which often requires a restatement of facts placed into context, college level writing requires students to present persuasive arguments in support of a clear thesis. Even an introductory level paper in a survey course will require students to take facts that are acquired during research, put them into a context, and then frame that information within arguments that support a particular position, whether the position is an acceptable response to the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, or persuasive paper that encourages the reader to be more ethical or responsible in the recycling of materials to avoid encouraging global warming. The topics are myriad, but the common characteristic of all college level writing is that the paper will be persuasive in nature. So, in preparing my thoughts for this series of videos, I've drafted a paper that seeks to coalesce my thoughts. And I've presented the paper in an academic format so as to demonstrate how the thought process that I go through in seeking to persuade you to write in a manner that I expect of my students. So, college level writing requires the presentation of arguments. The type of writing assignments in college will likely not just require the restatement of facts, as is common in high school papers, but will require the presentation of knowledge about data that are relevant to the topic and organized into arguments that form an interaction between the data that have been collected, the arguments that the students are presenting, and the thesis that the student wishes to persuade the audience to accept. And it's through this presentation of a persuasive complement of arguments that the student demonstrates to the faculty member their understanding of the relevant material. So unlike a multiple choice test in which the student chooses the correct answer to a precisely worded question, the paper requires the student to show understanding of the relevant material through the presentation of persuasive arguments. Academic writing is also distinguished from other types of writing, such as for a newspaper or a magazine, by the use of in-text citations and/or footnotes. The paper I'm displaying is written in APA style, so I've used a combination of citations and their complementary references as a means of defending the claims that I'm presenting in this video. The arguments that are presented in the academic paper need to be founded on and then defended by expert data. Whereas in a persuasive comment, we can call that an argument, presented between friends, one friend can say to the other, well, I think you should do XYZ because that's the way it's done at our school. And that may be sufficiently persuasive given that audience of two acquaintances. Academic writing has to be grounded in the knowledge of experts so that the arguments that are presented can be accepted even when the reader is not known to the writer. Or I should say the writer is not known to the reader. And college-level writing really requires careful planning. It's not just a restatement of facts. It's a presentation of arguments that seek to persuade the reader to accept a position, to accept the presented thesis. The arguments need to be organized into a manner that is cohesive so that the reader is led logically from one point to the next, eventually reaching a result that should require the reader to accept the initial thesis of the paper. The arguments are like bricks upon which the house is built, and one on top of the other leads to the final result that can stand all by itself. So the paper is a complement of arguments that support one another. The mortar that holds them together is logic, and the result is that the reader of the paper accepts the thesis just as the house stands because it's held together by the bricks and mortar. Now, whether the paper will stand as a written work or it will become part of an oral presentation, or it will be a combination of both a paper and an oral presentation, these same expectations exist. An oral presentation should, in an academic setting, should be founded in logic, built on expert information that leads the audience, in this case the listeners, to accept the thesis that the presenter offers. In preparing either an oral presentation or a written work, and for the remainder of this series, I'm going to address primarily written papers. The student needs to address 5 critical functions. The student must know to whom they are addressing their paper. In other words, who is the audience? What is the purpose of the paper? Or maybe even what is the thesis of the paper? What arguments will be presented and in what order they'll be presented? That can be addressed in the outline that's created prior to writing the paper. What is the thematic flow? Meaning, how will the arguments move one to the next? And then finally, what is the compositional style? Is it going to be a very technically, will it include very technical vocabulary, or will it be written in a style that's more easily accessible to someone who is not already an expert in the discipline of the topic? In this video, I'd like to specifically address the audience identification and taking into account to whom a paper is being addressed. Now, I recognize that most students probably think they are writing to their instructor. However, the instructor might think or might expect that the student write a paper to another third party, such as an assignment that requires the writing of a business marketing plan for an entrepreneurial company. The paper, in that case, should best be addressed to the founder of the company, even though the paper is really delivered to the instructor for a grade. The instructor then puts on the hat and pretends that they are the business person, and they are receiving this marketing plan from the student. A student in a social sciences or even a physical sciences class may be asked to write a paper on the social effects of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. In that case, the audience would be another social scientist, or I shouldn't say would be, but could be another social scientist. And when the instructor grades the paper, the instructor puts on the hat of being a social scientist to judge whether or not they are persuaded by the arguments presented in the student's paper. Where I have observed some challenges in student identification of their intended audience has arisen when either I failed to clearly tell the students, write your paper for this audience, or when I have assigned long-term projects, for example, a semester-long project that requires multiple component papers to be written and then combined together into a final project term paper. The students might forget that the paper should be addressed to a particular audience because I identified the audience in the very first component assignment, but I didn't remind the students through the semester, hey, each of these component papers is going to be combined together and then addressed to this particular audience. So it could be my fault for not repeating those instructions to the student, but also the student needs to take a certain amount of responsibility and remember that these are components of a larger project And if the first component is addressed to a particular audience, all of the components should be addressed to that same audience. When a student is unclear of to whom the paper should be addressed, it's really incumbent upon the student, you, to ask your instructor, to whom should I address my paper? Or maybe phrased a different way, for whom should my paper be written? A paper is almost never written with the instructor in mind. Papers are always written, well, I hate to say always, but almost always written for some other, possibly even hypothetical, audience in mind. So, at the risk of being repetitious, it's really important for you to know to whom you should be writing your papers. Not who will be grading them, but who is the audience to which your arguments are being addressed. And if your instructor hasn't told you very clearly, write your paper for X audience, you have to remember to ask. And every good faculty member that I've known in my entire career has had in mind an audience for each assignment that they've assigned. But we're human, and sometimes we faculty forget to tell students this. And so you as the student have to remember to ask. Once the audience for your arguments has been identified, you now have to analyze what the needs and the expectations of that audience will be in regard to the topic and the thesis that you'll be presenting in your paper. Name the audience. It is the chief executive of ABC Company, or it is to other social scientists, or it is to, I am writing a paper specifically for graduate level mathematics students. What does the audience already know about your topic? If they already know something, you don't have to then make arguments that defend those facts that the audience already knows. You can focus on new information that's going to be new to that audience. A similar question is, what does the audience need to know about your topic? Because all papers are persuasive, it's important to know, or to know what you expect the audience already knows, and what does the audience not yet know but should be aware of. So that combination of what does the audience know, that's material you don't have to repeat in your paper. What does the audience need to know, then that's material that you should include in your paper. What biases does the audience have toward your topic? We as humans carry a bag full of biases. We all have preconceptions, we all have opinions, we all have desires. These biases influence our ability to receive particularly contradictory information that contradicts the biases that we already have. So when attempting to persuade someone, if we expect that someone or that audience already has a bias against our thesis, then we have to prepare our arguments in a manner that clearly shows the logic of the alternative position that we are preparing in our papers. This is difficult. I won't quibble about it. It's hard to change someone's opinion. But it's possible that the audience has an opinion, but it's not firm. They haven't self-identified with the opinion, and therefore they are more likely to be persuaded to accept an alternative. And when looking at the audience, once you know what the audience already has knowledge of, what the audience's biases are, what should be presented to the audience, then you can conduct research that allows you to collect data that meets those particular writing objectives. And until you know who your audience is, and as you know as much about that audience as possible, you can't even begin the research process and the research process even precedes the formation of your arguments. So you've got to begin with an audience analysis. Clarify as much as possible who the audience is to whom you're addressing your arguments. And then you can gather the data that allows you to form arguments that are most likely to persuade that audience to accept your thesis. I hope this introduction to the academic writing process is helpful. It's important to begin with an identification of the topic that's been assigned by your instructor. Identify the audience to whom you should be presenting your arguments before you even start to collect data that allows you to draft your arguments. You have to know to whom you're making your presentation before you can create the presentation. As always, I wish you very happy academic writing. Bye for now.